Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm really excited to be here, and the reason for that is when I heard what the theme for this event was going to be, within and without, I got pretty fired up because it seemed like a perfect setting and opportunity to talk about a fundamental issue that is, in my opinion, at the root of many of the major challenges that we as humans are facing and are going to face as a species and a society. And that is this perceived disconnection between humans and the natural world. A false dichotomy, if you will, between us and them. And as the brilliant Rachel Carson pretty bluntly and eloquently put it, this is a problematic construct because the fact of the matter is that we are not separate from nature. There's no escaping this fact. If you think about what we're made of, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, it's the same stuff that everything else in the world is made of. If we think about how we exist and how we persist, it's through the same processes that sustain all other life on Earth. If you want to get really metaphysical with it and think about how did we get here, we're begat of the same processes and dynamics that have created all other life on Earth as well. And like it or not, we're also intricately and inextricably dependent on the resources, other organisms, and the physical environment provided by the world. But we still have this idea, generally speaking, that man is somehow different from nature. And it's not nearly as antagonistic as the quote by Rachel Carson that I just displayed. I don't think that people are actively seeking to destroy the natural world, but rather, consciously and unconsciously, the way that we perceive ourselves, we often seem to put man outside of the rest of the world. And implicitly in our economic and social systems, this dichotomy gets carried through as well. Even the supposed champions of conservation and appreciation of the natural world, like the Discovery Channel, fall prey to this trap, right? Man versus wild, us versus them. Nature is not the same thing as we are. And so I'm going to argue that this is really problematic, and as I mentioned before, underlies a lot of the fundamental challenges that we're starting to see manifest and are only going to continue to grow in the future, so long as we keep thinking this way. It turns out that the world is a sphere, or close enough. It's actually not a perfect spheroid. And it's a closed loop, right? The amount of matter doesn't really change. And it's this almost indescribably intricate and elegant system that maintains life on this planet, right? We learn about in science classes the cycles of carbon, water, nitrogen, that through a myriad processes cycle and recycle these building blocks of life throughout the globe, maintaining this incredible balance of systems that sustain conditions within a really very narrow spectrum to sustain life on Earth. So we're dealing primarily with closed loops, right? There's no addition or removal of matter. And so what this leads to in almost every ecosystem on the planet is a state of dynamic equilibrium, a balance, feedback loops that restore the natural order and balance of matter and energy when things start to get too far out of whack. One of the best examples of these that I can think of is a classic study from ecology in which scientists tracked the populations of lynx and snowshoe hare over decades. And they found that the abundances of these two animals, this predator and prey, showed this amazing synchronicity, right? So when rabbits increase, there's more food for lynx. Lynx can increase their population numbers, and eventually there's enough lynx that the rabbits start to not do so well. And when the rabbits start to not do so well, then the lynx don't do so well. So we see this oscillation that revolves around the steady state equilibrium. And this is the way that humans have existed for most of our time on this earth, actually. That is, up until the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution completely changed the way that we interact with and perceive the natural world, right? So with the invention of industry, we were suddenly able to consume resources faster than they could be replenished. We could start taking advantage of energy sources that are millions of years in the making, rather than relying on energy sources that are being created in the here and now, like animal power and wind power. And we could exploit and move resources, goods, and services across spatial extents that were inconceivable before. And so, as you might imagine, our system of consumption in relationship to the natural world started to look very different than those closed loop cycles we just saw. For instance, we have some resource that we think is useful. and we'll take that out of the natural environment. And for all intents and purposes, since it is unable to be used for anything else, we're going to say it basically goes one way into waste, whether that's garbage or, say, building material for a building that can't be used by anything else. Already this is looking a little different than the way that other ecosystems operate. We'll throw in the fact that most of our modern economies are based on some system of currency that facilitates these exchanges of goods and services. And since we got off the gold standard, money is actually created by banks making loans, or the Fed making loans. And as a college student with debts, I'm well aware that loans must be repaid eventually with interest. So now we've got added onto this unidirectional consumption of resources an economic model that requires continued consumption and continued growth just to sustain the whole system. What should be pretty clear at this point is that this paradigm is wildly different than any of the other processes in ecosystems really anywhere else in the world. I've heard some economists argue that you can have infinite economic growth in a finite planet if you add value in other ways besides consuming resources. I won't get into the details of that. But what I think is really inarguable is that you can't have infinite growth of humans, the number of people that are physically on this planet, without increased consumption of resources. But that is exactly what we've tried to do. We have continued to grow exponentially, basically, since the Industrial Revolution. And the way we've been able to pull this off on a finite world is because we're able to use our innovation and intelligence and creativity and all these wonderful gifts that we've been given to find ways to put off and avoid the consequences of consuming resources faster than they can be replaced, and to create an economic model where the costs of our activities are not reflected in prices. Let's think of an example to try to illustrate this latter point. Atrazine is a compound that's really great for farmers. It's an herbicide, and it's allowed us to grow vast quantities of crops to feed both North America, the United States, and the world. The only problem with atrazine is that it, in every other species that we have experimentally tested it on, chemically castrates and renders infertile individuals within a matter of generations of exposure. Now, what's the cost of this type of chemical being in our waterways and on our food, and us consuming this over a long period of time? What's the cost of being able to consume fossil fuels and shift the dynamics of the carbon cycle so rapidly that we actually throw off the equilibrium of things like the atmosphere and ocean acidity levels? Can we put a cost on that in our economic models? Finally, what's the cost of eating ourselves out of food? The state of many marine fisheries is deplorable currently because we've simply ate most of the main large fish species in the ocean. So just like we saw with the lynx and the rabbits, right? We're the predator here. We have our marine prey. And we've been consuming these marine prey at a rate to sustain that exponential growth of our human population. The only difference is once the marine prey start crashing, once the rabbits start to deplete, we just move on to another species while continuing to overexploit the species that is now barely able to produce sustainable yields. This is a neat trick that I'm not sure I'm aware of any other species that's able to pull it off, and certainly is not one that is sustainable only over any length of time. And unfortunately, it's usually crises like these that spur us into action. We've gone through such a crisis with wildlife in North America previously. So post-European settlement and leading up to 1900s, settlers that were expanding west basically wiped out all the major game species in North America. Herds of bison that numbered in the millions were dwindled down to a few thousand individuals. Predators like wolves were more or less driven to extinction. And even white-tailed deer, which we think about now, it seems unfathomable that white-tailed deer could be wiped out. But sure enough, they were basically all but eliminated from the continent. And this is because we were consuming wildlife and able to ship them from the frontiers back to cities. We had these vast markets for game, right? Not operating within the feedback loops and systems of balance that are naturally imparted in the natural world. But the wildlife situation is a bit of a success story and a reason for hope, because in 1900s, the Lacey Act was passed, 1900, excuse me, and this eliminated markets for game, right? You're no longer able to profit from selling harvested game, and it instilled this new model of relating to the natural world in which we considered wildlife in the public trust, a resource that couldn't be exploited for individual profit, but rather something that needed to be maintained for the benefit of all people on the continent. And so we'll see that the success here is many wildlife populations have begun to rebound. White-tailed deer are back in abundance. We have recovery of carnivore populations, and even the bison herds are coming back. But what I'd like to introduce here is that with this recovery of wildlife, we may be entering into a new decision point in which we once again have to consider what our relationship to the natural world is going to look like. So one of those species that's come back is the mountain lion. They've been pushing back from refugia in the western half of the continent. And I was lucky enough to work on a project studying recolonizing populations of mountain lion in Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park in Canada. And this is a really cool system because it's this island of trees up on these hills that's surrounded by otherwise pretty inhospitable prairie habitat. And the other thing is, being an interprovincial park, it also had this pretty significant human presence. There's something like 250,000 people visit this park every year. But sure enough, cougars had come back, they had recolonized this area, and the purpose of this study was to see how they were responding to human populations. If you look closely in this picture, you've got the cougar in the foreground, but there's actually a human right in the back. And I love this photo because it illustrates just how close proximity wildlife and even a big top carnivore like a mountain lion can live in proximity to humans. And they were doing that in the park. The study ended up finding that mountain lions shifted their use of the park a little bit in response to the influx of tourists, but their presence was established all year round. And this brings us to Connecticut, where we have another large carnivore that's reclaiming some of its historic range. Many of you may have had your own personal encounters with black bears as they've pushed back into Connecticut. And what's interesting is that Connecticut doesn't look like it did when the bears were here last time, after they were extirpated. There's people all over the place now, right? And so bears are reclaiming their former range, and they're running into people quite a bit. Oftentimes, this results in damage to property or other unwanted interactions. We've been doing a little bit of work in the state to try to describe these patterns. And as you might expect, the majority of these interactions between bears and people are occurring in places where natural land cover like forests and human development like suburbs and cities are meeting each other and integrating. So it's not completely a matter of bears just pushing their way into our suburbs. We have some control and responsibility over how this relationship with wildlife and how interactions between bears and people are going to look in the future. But bears seem to love the landscape that we've created for them. They're in relatively dense populations in and around places like Avon and Canton and Farmington, places with pretty high human populations. And they may presumably, as they continue to expand, push into towns like Washington, like Litchfield, as the population moves south. And we're actually beginning to understand that the highest densities of bear populations occur in low to medium density of housing. I'm going to say that again. The highest densities of bears occur in areas of low to medium housing, not in rural areas, not in undisturbed forests, but with some moderate presence of people. And this is a really interesting thing to consider because to me, it indicates that the view of nature as something different than man is a one-way view. The bears obviously don't see us as separate from them. The mountain lions in Canada did not see themselves as separate from people. We're part of the landscape, we're part of the nature, we're part of the natural world that they occupy. And so the question that I would pose to those of you that have time to consider such things as bears recolonizing Connecticut is, what sort of relationship are we going to formulate as things like bears and mountain lions and wolves and deer come back into the habitats that we formerly pushed them out of? Are we going to revert to a utilitarian, domineering attitude towards wildlife in which bears and things of the sort are relegated to isolated and far-off nature preserves? Or can we take a different perspective and start to think about our role and our responsibility as members participating in the same world that these animals are living in, to cohabitate? I have hope for the latter. There's lots of examples, actually, of successful cohabitation and integration of humans and wildlife. So Europe is actually a really good example of this. Europe has roughly twice the average density of humans as the United States does. And there's just a lot less space to create these big national parks like we have the benefit of enjoying here. But what some long-term research has found is that large carnivore populations in Europe, under a model of integrating wildlife habitat in and around human development, is actually sustaining relatively robust populations of carnivores like brown bears and wolves and wolverines and lynx. So there is, it seems, perhaps another way forward besides either getting rid of all the things that scare us, consuming and over-harvesting wildlife for our own benefit until there is no more of it, or keeping it off in preserves where we can separate it from ourselves and not think about it. An example closer to home is the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone National Park, which is really, again, a beacon of hope for how we might start to see our relationship to wildlife a little bit differently and our relationship to the natural world. So wolves were one of those species that fell prey to some prejudice and over-harvesting prior to 1900 and were pretty much wiped out from Yellowstone. What we didn't anticipate is the cascading effects that removing a top predator like wolves would have from that whole ecosystem. So without wolves, it turns out, elk can just go crazy browsing and grazing wherever they want. And they have no fear of predators, so they'll linger by stream sides, eliminating all the new growth of aspen and brushes and other riparian plants, which really degrades waterways. They start moving faster. There's no habitat for beavers, no habitat for songbirds. Amphibian populations end up taking a big hit when water isn't able to collect around riparian vegetation. The whole ecosystem started to fall apart. Something that we could have never anticipated prior to eliminating wolves from this habitat, because we often can't comprehend the intricacies of the inner dynamics of different species in their ecosystem and our place in the ecosystem. But the hope comes in that wolves were eventually reintroduced to Yellowstone. And in one of the clearest examples of the interconnectedness of natural ecosystems, you return wolves, you lower the elk population a little bit, you make elk less bold to browse near riversides, and suddenly there's this explosion of biodiversity, and the ecosystem is restored to its natural balance. This goes even further, understanding our relationship to nature. This is a picture taken from Banff National Park in which a large undertaking to build wildlife crossing structures happened. A really cool example of how if we apply some of that creativity and ingenuity and intelligence that has been so successful in allowing us to increase our own population exponentially, we can understand how we fit into the picture of the rest of the natural world and accommodate both our needs and the needs of other species on this planet. And so I'd extend that question that I posed relative to bears to what sort of relationship do we want to form with the natural world? I think we have a choice as to whether or not we can continue to operate in these unidirectional exponential growth type models and wait and see what the consequences are going to be, or use that capacity that I've spoke about to understand how we can integrate our activities into the systems and into those loops that I mentioned before, such that we're operating in a more harmonious state with the rest of the world. I started with a quote by Rachel Carson that I really like, but I think I'd like to end with this one that I like even more. And as you ponder what that actually means, I would encourage you to really try to embrace this perspective and not appreciate the world as it exists as something that's external to us, to be beheld at a distance, but rather as the amazing and wonderful place that it is and that we are a part of.